I was out in the kitchen preparing lunch. Anne was in the lounge doing some ironing. There came the knock on the door, and I looked out of the kitchen window and saw these two young chaps in dark suits. My first thought was it's probably the Mormons or from the electric company we've had several calls for, and I really ignored them and thinking they'd probably go away. But of course they didn't, and they persisted in knocking, and Anne suddenly said, God, she said, it might be the military. So I shot to the door and opened the door, and these two smart young men in these dark suits were there, and they showed me their IDs, but that could have been anything after I discovered it was the military. And they came in, and they came in here and sat down. And first thing they said was, is there anything we can get you? Can we get you a cup of tea, or can we call anybody? And Anne said to them, all we want to know is he dead? And after a couple of minutes of preamble, they said, yes, he is. He was killed this morning at about 6:30 our time. This would be about 10 o'clock. So they'd come, they'd been briefed, and they'd come to see us straight away.
So complete shock, and just a case of being, I suppose, completely stunned by the news.
Exactly, that's exactly it. It just wipes your mind clean, and there's nothing, you don't know what to say. There's nothing to say really, and it takes you a bit of time to get it into your head that he's actually dead. I mean, sometimes now, when we look at his photos, it's very, very difficult to realise he's not coming back. Sorry about all this. I just hope that nobody who's listening to this has to go through what we went through, because you don't bury your kids, do you?
Well, I mean, being a serving soldier, there is always, obviously he chose to go into the armed forces, and there's always that prospect that that's going to happen. But as a parent, as you say, you never think you're going to bury your children.
No, you don't.
So ultimately, you presumably never prepare for something like this.
No, we were totally unprepared for it. We knew he was in a dangerous place, but we didn't actually know what he was doing because it was secret. But after all his tales about being in Iraq, we thought, well, you tend to think they're fireproof. And we never, ever thought that it would happen to him. We did, it crossed his mum's mind that he might get badly injured at one point, but we never, ever in our worst nightmares thought he'd be killed. And he said to his mum, he said, if I get blown up or I lose a limb, he said, I know what I'm going to do. He said, I'm going to become an athlete, an Olympic athlete. So he was quite prepared for it. He went into it with his eyes wide open. But you just can't imagine that it's going to happen to any of you or yours. I mean, it's like we all were when we were that age. You're fireproof, aren't you?
I mean, I understand. Obviously, it's still very difficult and it's still very raw. But can you tell me a bit about what happened to Mark? How he ended up being killed in Afghanistan?
Yes, on the day in question, they left their patrol base and were going out to do a patrol around the area, and they knew that in a certain place there was an insurgents, not a meeting place, but where they were in some strength, and they came out and they walked down the road. It's just a track really, and they were out for about an hour and a half. And they came up to a crossroads, and as they were crossing, they were going to cross the road between an old wall and a mud hut sort of thing on the other side. They were engaged from three sides by the insurgents, and it was a pretty heavy firefight was going on. And anyway, they had to try and get across this road to try and pick up some cover from the building which was on the other side. And Johnny Mercer, his commander, he just ran across the road and got there, was up against the side. And Mark was always a couple of paces behind him, and Mark made his dash across the road, and Johnny was sort of looking round to try and find out where all this fire was coming from and trying to suppress it as best he could. And suddenly one of the other lads who was with him shouted out, Bing's down, boss. Bing's down. And Johnny turned round, and there was Mark lying in the middle of this track, and the chap who was shouting was on his feet, sort of shouting at him that Bing was down, and he said, "For God's sake, get down!" He said, "You're going to be shot as well." Anyway, he eventually did, and he was trying to pull Mark back, but Mark, being a big lad, and he was carrying sort of 62 kilos of kit, including his radio and then the rifle and all the rounds of ammunition. He couldn't move him. And Johnny said, "I was standing against this wall, just waiting to be shot." You know, it was anyway. Eventually, they managed to get down and pull him back. Pull Mark back into the ditch, and they just had to wait there until such time as they were lifted out. And when they got back to there were some armoured vehicles about half a mile away, and they got back to them, and it turned out that when they got there, there wasn't room in the back for Johnny and the stretcher. So they got him off the stretcher, and Johnny sat with him on his knee while they drove back to a safe place. I mean, that's all above beyond the call, isn't it? And that's really how it happened. He was hit in the cheek, and the bullet unfortunately went straight through and out through his spine, out through his neck, and he was dead before he hit the ground. You know, I suppose, as we've often said, thank the Lord he didn't tread on a bomb, but it's terrible.
And Michael, one of the officers that was with him at the time, he's written you quite a personal letter explaining what happened on that day.
Yes.
But not only that, also, you know, how good a soldier and also how much of a friend he was to him.
That's right. Yeah, he just explains where and how he was killed, and that's purely factual stuff. And then he goes on to say, Lance Bombardier Chandler was, in my eyes, the perfect soldier. He remained constant, whether in combat or not. His selfless commitment to the cause truly set him apart from his peers. No self-conscious pride was found in him at all. He would just as readily volunteer to empty the bins as he would be in a strike force closing with the insurgents, as he was when he was killed. He was the man that men aspire to be. Whenever I was diving out of the way, Lance Bombardier Chandler would be sat in the ditch next to me, grinning at me without a single look of bother on his face. Laughing. His sanity and calm humour kept many a contact at bay. He was the perfect fire support T-Mac, and many commanders say it's an absolute privilege to command their men, although I know this not always to be strictly true. He was an absolute privilege to command and an example of a man.
In the pictures that are around the room here, I think in pretty much every photograph he's smiling or grinning.
Yeah,
that's the sort of person he was. He was quite a happy-go-lucky type of lad.
Yes, he was. And lots of his friends say they miss his smile and his humour. And he had had a lot of humour in him, and could see the funny side of most things, actually. Mischievous. Yeah, mischievous is a good word. And he was known for it. He was known for his big smile, and this is what a lot of his friends said. We shall miss it. You know, we shall miss his big smile. The last time I saw him, actually, I'd driven him up to Otterburn in Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, where they were preparing to leave. That was the assembly point they were leaving the following day. And I took him helped him carry his kit to the billet, met a few of his friends, and the last thing I saw of him, he was standing in the barracks doorway with a huge smile on his face. So I drove away.